Welcome to History Corner. I'm John Madden, historian, artist, historian, philosopher, actually. I've gotten a lot of requests to do talks about history. I spent 20 years as a military historian, and I spent another 15 years doing history of all over the world. Classical, I would qualify as a classicist, which is at least study of antiquity, a medievalist, political, social, and evolutionary histories, as well as the history of film and media, particularly, which I have degrees in. So, because I am known to ramble, we're going to set this on a strict 5-minute timer. And my son Thompson, who's operating the camera and is the better part of this partnership, has something he wants to know. So this week, we'll give him 5 minutes of knowledge, whatever I have on whatever he asks. So, what would you like to know about, son?
So I know that in like World War II, the Soviet Union was not really super prepared for Germany's attack. Despite the fact that there was a bunch of warnings beforehand, they didn't really get their industry rolling. They didn't really industrialize that quickly, although they were industrializing at somewhat of a rate just because of the way Stalin ran things. With that in mind, how did they manage to industrialize quickly enough to just make enough tanks and guns and etc. to beat back the Germans? How'd they do it?
Okay, so the question, as I understand it, is how did the Soviet Union recover from the German Operation Barbarossa invasion of 1941, and how did they manage to survive long enough to get their industrial output to where it needed to be to turn the tide? Is that roughly it?
Yeah, I suppose it is.
Okay. Let us begin. We'll do what we can. Well, shortest answer I can give is Stalin paid for it with Russian blood. He bought time with blood. And he bought time with space, which is the historic Russian defense throughout their entire history. They have had so much territory, even before they had the stands and the growth of Peter the Great and all his conquests of Central Asia. Russia, at least the part facing Europe, has had enormous distances. And so historically, when they would get invaded from the east, which was often, they would burn everything in the path of the invaders and just head east. So I'm sorry, they were invaded from the west. I got that backwards, didn't I? Well, anyways, if they're coming from Europe, they retreat going that way. And if they're coming from Asia, they retreat going that way. And in every case, they trade land for time. So that's the first thing. Now, the reason that Stalin was in such a bad situation is because he's a paranoid communist, asshole, genocidal dictator who is more concerned with politics than reality. And so he is sitting in a historical neuroses endemic to the Russian psyche, which is they're terrified of the yellow peril of the Mongol horde in the east, what they called the Golden Yoke, because that ruled them for 500 years. It's a terrible time. But they're also pathologically afraid of Germans, particularly, because the Germans have been historically they've not gotten along. The challenge in the pivot for control over the sphere of influence of Eastern and Central Europe. The Russians want Serbia, they want Hungary, they want Romania, they want everything on their border. The Germans also want those things, and so they beef constantly. When the Germans invaded, they hit a Russian army that had all of its, a Soviet army that had its leadership decapitated. I think they had 2 4-star generals and almost nothing. Everybody else down to almost colonel had been murdered for political reasons, because Stalin, just like Hitler, was terrified and distrustful of his military. Stalin distrusted it because the Red Army had been built by Trotsky, who he had murdered with an ice pick in Mexico City after they had a falling out, which is pretty typical for the communists. They just murder. That's what they did. So he gave up. I think they took somewhere in the vicinity of 2 million casualties in the first 2 weeks. And most countries would have buckled under that. But Russia had an enormous, they've always had an enormous amount of people. And they had a lot of Ukrainians that they could throw into the front, and Belarusians. And remember that the western border of the Soviet Union at that time was halfway into Poland, because Nazis and commies had split Poland in their non-aggression pact. And of course, the commies had also scooped up all the Baltic states. So they start backpedaling and giving up hundreds of thousands, millions of casualties, and eventually they use their civilian manpower to disassemble the factories of the Ural mountain area and the Donetsk basin, which is like eastern Ukraine, kind of, where they had their heaviest industry, and they literally put it on train tracks, and the last car was a track ripper, and they just went the other direction. So as the Germans advanced, they found burnt fields, burnt villages. They killed everybody they could find who was a communist or Jewish or any other of a long list of undesirables. And they just couldn't, even at the pace that they were going, which was like 100 kilometers a day, they could not catch the Russians sufficiently quickly to prevent that reindustrialization further east, which is when then Russia got serious about, the Soviet Union got serious about war production. And they standardized their models down to like 3 things: T-34s, 76 millimeter artillery guns, artillery pieces, and PPSH machine guns and small arms. And then that's all they did. They just cranked those out as fast as they could. And eventually they diversified their armor forces and rebuilt their air force with an enormous amount of resources sent over the Arctic by the US and British, and even some up through Iran, through the British Empire, to help them by the time they needed. That's it. We'll see you another time.